Thank you very much, and kia ora koutou to everybody. Kia ora koutou, ko tai mai tēnei zui. So welcome everyone who's joining us today for this session about biofuels and New Zealand's proposed Sustainable Biofuels Obligation Bill. I'm Veronika Meduna, and my job is to start us off with brief introductions of the topic and our speakers. But just very quickly, let me tell you a bit about how we're planning to run this conversation. So this has been organised by Oxfam Aotearoa with Greenpeace and the Don't Burn Our Future campaign as part of Oxfam Aotearoa's Don't Burn Food campaign. And we have three excellent speakers who will each give us a short presentation from their perspective on this topic of biofuels. Then we'll have a discussion. There should be time for your questions. So if you have them, please put them in the chat. We'll do our best to answer at least some of them. So now, in legalese terms, the bill we're discussing tonight proposes an obligation on anyone, person or company, who imports or refines more than 50,000 litres of liquid fossil fuels for transport to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions intensity of those fuels by also supplying sustainable biofuels. The bill does include some sustainability criteria, but the determination or the regulations around what actually makes a biofuel sustainable and which resources we should use to make these biofuels, all that lies with the Minister in charge of energy, and that's the crux of it, and more on that soon from our speakers. So first, and joining us all the way from Brussels, we have Laura Buffett. Laura is Energy Director at Transport and Environment, and she manages campaigns that are focused on making European fuels policy more sustainable. She describes the goals of those campaigns as moving away from oil and even beyond land-based biofuels towards better alternatives, especially renewable electricity. Laura holds a master's degree in public administration and environmental law from the University of Strasbourg. We'll also hear from Jake Roos. Jake's an expert in the field of sustainable energy and climate change. He holds a master's in energy science from the University of Otago, and he's got more than a decade of experience advising local government on energy and climate change mitigation. He's involved in community activism on climate change, including the Don't Burn Our Future campaign. But if you look him up on social media, you'd be forgiven to think that he spends his time building Lego, because he's also the Lego Masters New Zealand champion with his teammate, Glenn Knight. And our third speaker is Ralph Sims. Ralph is Professor Emeritus at Massey University, and he's spent more than 5 decades studying, teaching sustainable energy, including biofuels. He started out developing processes for producing biofuel from beef tallow, that's the fatty waste from meat production. And he's maintained his interest ever since. He's a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has been involved in 5 reports on mitigation. He's advised the International Energy Agency, the OECD, and the World Bank. So each of them will talk briefly and then we'll discuss. But since the New Zealand bill is modelled on the EU's legislation, which has already been introduced. Laura, could we start with you? Could you explain the EU's biofuels policy and what's worked or hasn't?
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. So thanks a lot for inviting me to speak today and to participate in that discussion. I'm really happy to share the biofuels experience we've had in the EU. Transport and Environment has followed this policy for more than a decade now, and myself personally for 9 years. So I'm really happy to share what we've learned here. So maybe as a background information, the EU has set up a target for biofuels around 2008-2009. And basically it's mandated every EU country to have a certain share of renewable energy in transport by 2020. And this was a mandatory target that drove the use of biofuels mostly. And then we have now new targets for 2030. So, I mean, we had more than a decade of policy. So I think we have already a lot of elements to show what has worked and what hasn't. I think the first thing I wanted to highlight is that this biofuels policy has mainly driven the use of food crops to be burned for biofuels with very negative environmental, social, climate impacts. So after all these years, it's clear that first, biofuels have a negative land use impacts when you look at crop biofuels, you're actually adding demand for agricultural land when you're setting targets for these biofuels. And because of that, you're pushing the agricultural frontiers to expand in high carbon stock areas, whether it's forest or other rich carbon areas. And therefore, you have this indirect deforestation effect linked to the biofuels targets. And unfortunately, the EU biofuels policy doesn't factor that in, like it doesn't take into account this indirect deforestation. But if you would take the deforestation into account, most crop biofuels in the EU, which is crop biodiesel like rapeseed, palm oil, or soy, are actually worse for the climate than fossil diesel when you factor in all these land use emissions. The second important impact, and I think other speakers will speak more about it, is also the competition with food. There's a direct link, by burning food crops is de facto competing with using these crops for other purposes like food uses. And there's been several mentions of the fact that without biofuels, crop prices would actually be lower because of the pressure on the crop market. Another element is the social impacts. So we've been also witnessing a lot of negative impacts on the ground in countries like Indonesia, Brazil, but not only, because of the pressure on the land again. We've had also a recent report from Oxfam Belgium showing human rights violation in sugarcane plantations in Peru. So we have a lot of examples showing that, again, the additional demand for agricultural land for biofuels is having negative impacts at the local level. So because of all these negative impacts, the EU actually decided to reform its policy quite soon. So we had the policy in place in 2008, 2009, and already in 2015, after years of campaigning and discussions, the EU decided to limit the amount of food-based biofuels it would use. And then later on, that limit was strengthened. And finally, we also decided to phase out the use of palm oil biofuels by 2030. But despite these fixes, the policy is still not a good policy, and I'm going to explain so why. So I think I just wanted to share some key numbers to just give a sense of the scale of the problem. So first, if you look at biodiesel today, so the biofuel we use to replace some part of diesel, Europe alone burns the equivalent of 19 million bottles of best cooking oil every day for biofuels. So it's cooking oil that we could use for, of course, for food and other purposes, but no, we're burning it for cars and trucks. In terms of wheat, for example, it's around 10,000 tons of wheat every day that is being turned into biofuels. And so again, that gives you like a sense of the huge scale we're talking about. These are like enormous quantities. And in the end, because of the biofuels policy, EU drivers became the first consumers of palm oil in Europe. Because the targets were set in place in 2008, 2009, then we saw a huge increase in imports over time, not only from palm oil, from other feedstocks as well. But yeah, in the end, people were trying to avoid palm oil in food and cosmetics. Here, there's been a huge campaign about that. But in the end, they maybe end up driving their cars or trucks on palm oil because of the policy. I know there's going to be more talk about waste-based biofuels later on, but on waste-based biofuels, the same thing happened. So we started to become more and more importers of things like used cooking oil. So now more than half of the used cooking oil we produce for biofuels in Europe is actually imported from countries like China or the US. And that's clearly not a sustainable pathway when every country will have to decarbonize and meet the Paris Agreement. We don't think that relying on imports is the way to go for energy future. So if maybe one point in the context of the New Zealand draft policy, I'm not aware of all the details of what's being discussed at the moment, but I know that there's also this idea of the fact that not allowing palm oil and soy-based biofuels would be already a great solution. But actually, I mean, even though it's reflecting the fact that these are some of the worst biofuels, it's not going to fix the policy. And the reason is that the question is not about the type of biofuels per se, but it's about how you use our land. And it's much better to focus land use on food production, on rewilding, on carbon sequestration than on growing crops, then being burned for energy. Also, I think, I mean, we've seen more and more extreme climate events, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world, and relying on crops as a source of energy doesn't seem to be the most realistic, sustainable, and reliable pathway for energy independence. There's also a lot of claims about certification being the solution for all these issues again. But here, certification is as strong as the policy that is under it, basically behind it. So if you don't have strong criteria in the policy, certification is not going to help you to make things better. And what we've seen as well is that certification is unable to capture the leakage effects of the system. So all this indirect deforestation, certification cannot capture it. So that's why we don't think certification would be the answer to the question of crop-based biofuels. And maybe a final point on the EU biofuels policy is that we've had recent developments, which are quite important, I think, for the discussion you're having in New Zealand. The fact that the EU has developed now specific policies for aviation and shipping, for fuels in aviation and shipping. And there's been an agreement, it still has to be finalized, but that crop-based biofuels from food commodities would not count, would not be eligible, because these are not sustainable and not seen as like a long-term solution. So I think it's an important precedent that for aviation, for shipping, for all the new demands in these sectors, food-based biofuels do not have a role to play. So I think, I mean, I've given you kind of an overview of what hasn't worked. Of course, there are things that are working a bit better. There's been a focus on waste and residues, but here we need to be careful about what we consider waste and residues and still be realistic about the fact that the volumes are going to be limited. So that's an important point. I think it's always the scale, what can we really reach with different options. But overall, I would say that, yeah, I think my recommendation would be not to duplicate the EU biofuels policy. We've managed to fix some things, but it's still far from perfect. Focus rather on demand reduction and cleaner alternatives. Do not allow crop-based biofuels to qualify. And on e-waste and residue, be careful. And I think the main lesson we've learned here is really to get things right from the start should be the priority, because otherwise you're going to end up like us, having 10 years of biofuels debate, being very toxic, having U-turn in policy and in investments, and I think that's not going to help anyone. So yeah, I think I will stop here and happy to answer questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's been very informative. I'm glad you got at the end towards some things that have worked, because it really sounded like most things quite predictably haven't worked, because it reminds me of what happened in the US with corn, sort of similar trajectories. Now, Jake, do you want to pick up from there? I know you've described the proposed bill in New Zealand as a pointless distraction, but before you get to why you're opposing it, can you fill it in a little bit more than I was in doing at the start, just what exactly the bill proposes? I know that aviation for us is already excluded in this proposal, so it's already separate, but you know, who are those companies that fall into this, that would be under this bill and making those biofuels? And then, you know, you can tell us what you think about it.
Thanks, Veronika. There is a handful of fuel importers in the country. They're all fairly big names. They'd be the ones, anyone imports fuel, as you said, over 50,000 litres would be subject to it, but we're only talking about a handful of players here. And what they would be required to do, or rather what they would have to do to avoid the fines, which the bill levies, this is how it works, if you don't do it, you get fined, is to meet the greenhouse gas intensity targets, which rise from 2.4% from when it starts 2023 up to 9%. So what the government's asking is for fuel suppliers to reduce the greenhouse gas intensity of their fuel by blending in biofuel. And it doesn't exclude food specifically. It has sustainability criteria that talk about a lot of good stuff about, you know, not being at risk of inducing land use change and not causing biodiversity loss. And if those criteria are strictly adhered to, basically, I don't think there would be any food in this obligation. Because it's a greenhouse gas intensity target, the targets aren't actually for the volume of fuel. So it's not 2.4% of fuel in 2023. It's a 2.34% reduction in emissions. So that makes waste look very attractive, because the way the bill's drafted is, if it's waste, it has zero emissions upstream from when it's made into biofuel. It's just like, oh, if no one wants it, then let's just say that its emissions have been accounted for elsewhere for its first use, and that there are no emissions. So if you used waste, then it would be 2.4% of volume. But if it's food, then and they're following the emissions factors that include land use change, then it would be a greater volume. So there's really strong incentives to use waste and to define things as waste. And as the bill is written at the moment, both waste and things called residue products, which aren't waste, they're byproducts, get this exemption from all the sustainability criteria. So that creates an enormous motivation for fraud, obviously, because there isn't enough of that waste around. Essentially, things like, I'm sure Ralph will talk about tallow and things, but all of New Zealand's tallow is being exported at the moment for $2,000 a tonne or something in that region. He'll probably correct me on that, but it's a lot of money. So it's clearly not waste, it's highly sought after. So and the only other real kind of waste product we're talking about here is used cooking oil. You can't use food waste, from your kitchen scrap bin. It has to be quite pure stuff in order to be refined into a liquid fuel. So we're talking used cooking oil. Of course, New Zealand doesn't have that much used cooking oil. We'll be importing it, and the advice from the officials to government is that this will be a 100% import bill. They don't expect for there to be any significant domestic production of biofuels. So we'll be looking abroad and saying, can you send us used cooking oil, please? But we don't want palm oil, we want used cooking oil, right? And already Europe is half of their used cooking oil is imported, and there's evidence from Europe that a lot of that is fraudulent, because you can imagine the motivation. I can't sell my palm oil, no one wants to buy it off me anymore because they think it's bad, but if it's used cooking oil, then they'll pay top dollar. So obviously that creates a massive moral hazard. And so so we're getting into that territory. That's what we're concerned about. Basically, the lack of the real true sustainable feedstocks. There's just not enough of it, and we're setting up a system that will encourage fraud. And because these supply chains are so long, we don't have any visibility over that. The government wants to use the certification schemes, the ISCC and the RSB schemes. But those schemes, basically the way it works is that the suppliers provide paperwork to the schemes, and the schemes check the paperwork and issue the certification based on whether the paperwork says the right things. So there's no kind of like police going and like checking stuff. And of course it will be impractical too. We're talking about supply chains that spread around the world outside our jurisdiction to police. Certifications can't really help, and obviously need to be treated with a lot of skepticism, given that we know there's not enough of this true waste. Waste is something that you throw away that no one else wants. It's not used for anything else. Things that and there's not a lot of that fits that description that can be made into liquid biofuel. And the other real risk that we see is that, and Laura can probably attest to this, is that the fuel companies do need to invest in this. They have to spend a significant amount of money on tanks and pipes and all sorts of things to be able to handle this fuel, especially with ethanol, which can't actually touch some of the pipelines that are used for petrol because of the effect it has on fuel quality standards. So they need to make a significant investment in tanks and pipes and things. And of course, once they've made that investment, they won't like government U-turns. they would like to get a return on their investment. And then other people get used to selling stuff into New Zealand as well, and they hire lobbyists. And this has all been seen before in other countries, of course. That's why we know about it. And basically, it gets very hard to change the scheme, because there's no vested interest at the moment, but the obligation will create vested interest, because biofuel is very expensive. That's why we're not using much of it at the moment. It's because it's very expensive, and the only thing that makes it viable for the fuel suppliers is the mandate, and it creates a level playing field across all of those players, so that they all have to do it, or they'll get fined. So they all do it. Yeah, the whole thing falls apart without the mandate. So if you spend a lot of money satisfying the mandate, you won't want the mandate to go away. And so that's the real trap I see us falling into. And ultimately, the real problem is that that they don't reduce emissions. Like the amount of genuine stuff we can get is really small. So a small bit will only reduce emissions a tiny amount, and you might say, well, that's worth it. But if you create a gigantic risk of cutting down rainforests as a side effect, if it goes wrong, well, that's a serious consideration. You can't just say, oh, well, whoopsie, we cut down a rainforest. You know, everyone pays that price ultimately, some more directly than others. So yeah, so from our point of view, we can see the potential for some good biofuels somewhere, but we just feel this policy will create a monster, and you know, and it won't be put down easily once it's in place. So it's better just not to go there. Essentially, the risks far outweigh the benefits in our view.
Either not to go there or get it right from the start, like Laura was saying, actually learn from other experiences and get it right.
Exactly. It's not like we're doing this for the first time. We can look to Europe and we can look to the USA and hopefully learn from their experience.
Speaking about experience, Ralph, you have decades of experience looking into waste sources for biofuels, in particular tallow. And while I was listening to Jake, I was thinking, you know, in our context, forestry / any forestry waste. Do we have, what do you think about what the sources, waste sources, not food crop sources, but waste sources that might be available?
Yeah, okay, well, I'll go back a little bit of history, because the first oil shock was 1973, and we started producing biodiesel, we didn't call it that, from rapeseed oil, vegetable rapeseed oil. And because of the oil shock, the farmers down in Southland didn't have any diesel, there was a shortage, they couldn't harvest their crops, so they were producing their own rapeseed oil and putting it in their tractors, just raw. And I went down to tell them under Minister Bill Birch that actually that's not a very good idea in the long term. So we knew that growing crops wasn't a good idea, just as Jake and Laura have told us. And so we looked at what else there was, and another triglyceride, which is what a vegetable oil is animal fat. And at that time we had 110,000 tons, not of beef tallow, Veronika, but of inedible tallow, because beef tallow is good for sort of cooking and food and such like. So it was inedible tallow that was being exported for soap and candles. And so we started to use that. We put it in a Ford 5000 tractor, and it smelled like a fish and chip shop, but it worked. And we then modified the chemical. And that was the equivalent to about the volume of diesel that we used in New Zealand at the time. So it showed good promise. And we had trucks and trains and boats all running on this. And we spent, I don't know, $1 million of Liquid Fuels Trust Board research funding. And we knew it worked. And then the oil price went down. And so we gave that idea away and moved on to something else. But then 3 years ago, was it 4, Z Energy, which Laura is a New Zealand oil retailing company, petroleum products retailing company, built a tallow ester plant up in Wiri. And so it takes 40 years for my research to get commercialized, which isn't bad really if you can wait that long. And so, and they were all keen and enthusiastic. And then, as Jake quite rightly says, the tallow price rocketed up, and therefore it wasn't viable to do that. At the same time, we were working on biodiesel tallow esters. Lincoln College in those days was growing various crops for ethanol, and they came up with fodder beet as being the best crop in terms of litres per ethanol per hectare. And that research is there, but it's still a land use competition, and still, like oilseed rape and other oil crops, very low yields per hectare in terms of the actual product. And at the same time as we were doing that, Forest Research Institute, now Scion, in answer to your question, Veronika, we're looking at forest slash from Pinus radiata, and in enzymatic hydrolysis of lignocellulosic waste has been done at various places. Scion worked on this project for 40 years and in the end gave up, because Pinus radiata is quite a resinous tree, and in the end it didn't work. It wasn't commercially viable. So we do have this resource. We can, and we're competing for heat and power, which is where most of this slash is destined for now, to displace coal. We can gasify, we can pyrolyze it, we can do other clever things with it, but it's going to be very costly, as Jake said, and so therefore we do not have it is a waste resource, because most of it at the moment is left in the forest. And I've been involved in taking out logs and my own forest and selling the logs, and you're left with an awful lot of volume behind. But that's best captured, as in Sweden, Finland, Denmark, Austria, not Denmark so much, where that slash is turned into heat and power in really large scale cogeneration plants. So we know how to do that. They've been doing it over there for 30, 40 years. So I got to, just, if I may share my screen, I've got just to go forward with some sort of more positive suggestions. Here it is here. And hopefully you can see that. Can you see some words up there? Yes, somebody's nodding. Is that right, Jake? You can see them? Good. Okay, thanks. So, except of course, the top bit, I can't get rid of that. Anyway, this was so having worked on biofuels back in the 1970s, I didn't do very much for a while. But this report came out when I was involved with the Science and Technical Advisory Panel of the Global Environment Facility, based in Washington. And I was a member of the panel. And the GEF funds $1 billion of projects around the world, 140 recipient countries every year. And so we were given some advice to the GEF about what they might do about transport biofuels if they were supporting those, optimizing the global environment benefits of transport biofuels. And basically, biofuels can enhance, now I can't read that because of these little photographs here, never mind. How do I get rid of those? I don't know if I can. Biofuels can enhance the country's long-term energy security, reduce dependence on imported oil products, promote economic and social development for livelihoods for the rural poor, and provide income for the nation as a whole. So it's all positive stuff. This is verbatim from the summary. However, if adequate environment and social safeguards are not in place, production and use of biofuels in a given region can have perverse outcomes such as increased greenhouse gas emissions and/or adverse impacts on the land, water, food supply, biodiversity. Exactly what we're talking about here. So this was our advice. Therefore, when deciding to support a biofuels project, policymakers must carefully consider the issues. And so there are good biofuels and there are bad biofuels. And this was what we were trying to say. Biofuels must meet strict guidelines to ensure that overall benefits outweigh economic, environmental, or social costs. And this report provides guidance on evaluating the risks. So everything we're talking about here today was the advice we were given to the Global Environment Facility, which is, like I say, a large organization. And more recently, the IPCC Working Group 3 sixth assessment report came out in March 20 this year. And chapter 7 on agriculture, forests and other land use says bioenergy, biofuels and other bio-based options represent an important, I can't read it, potential of the total mitigation potential. So there is opportunity there. So this has been recognized. And IPC, of course, assesses all the science, brings all the latest information together. And this is an interesting analysis here. The range of recent estimates for the technical bioenergy potential. This is all the science, hundreds of papers on this topic. When constrained by food security and environmental considerations, can still produce, and on the right-hand side, 5 to 50 exajoules per year of energy for residues and for dedicated biomass production growing crops, 50 to 250 exajoules per year. We consume about 600 exajoules per year. So what it's saying is that the bioenergy, biomass, including biofuels, could make quite a substantial contribution to that primary energy. But there are large ranges there, 5 to 50 and 50 to 250, because nobody knows. And these are all the different assessments. And these estimates fall within the previously estimated ranges. So the IPCC hasn't sort of dismissed it. And in chapter 10 that I was involved with this time, and like you say, Veronika, it's my 5th report, I think, decarbonisation options for shipping and aviation still require research and development but advanced biofuels, ammonia, synthetic fuels as emerging as possible options. And there's a medium confidence in that based on the science. And this is the key issue, which is where the New Zealand policy is at odds. And as you said, the aviation is excluded from this in New Zealand. But these are the challenging ones. We do have an electric two-seater pipistrelle aeroplane buzzing around New Zealand now, and there's 10-seaters and there's 20-seaters electric planes coming on. But the project and I've done some work with the United Arab Emirates, where 13% of their GDP comes from aviation in one form or another. And they're working hard with the International Civil Aviation Organization and the International Maritime Organization to see what options they've got, and biofuels rate highly there. So if we are going to use biofuels, then really we should be targeting those markets. This is a graph which shows the from 2011 to 2021, a decade of biofuels globally, and the bottom yellow is ethanol, and the orange is biodiesel, and at the top there is hydrogenated vegetable oils, which is mainly sort of coming out of Sweden and Scandinavia. And there has been a steady growth, but only steady. But the point about that is it's only 3.3% of global transport fuels. And as Jake quite rightly says, and Laura too, where are we going to get our biofuels from if we don't produce them ourselves? Because there will be a lot of competition for this. The ethanol is mainly Brazilian sugarcane ethanol and American corn ethanol, but there are other sources as well. And the biodiesel, a large part of that comes from the palm. But I want to leave you with this thought, that the total global land area that we have is this graph here, and about 38% is used for agriculture, and that's on the left-hand side. So the natural vegetation and ice fields and mountains and whatever is the natural. But of that 38%, 80% is pasture and animal feed, which is, you can see pastures 26% of the total, and crops for animals is 6%. So our crops for human is only 6% of total land use. If we reduce our waste of food, which is about 30%, then of food that we produce but we don't consume, then that would free up a lot of land. And if we move away from animal products, then move towards more vegetable crops, then that would free up a lot of land. And we've got to do both of those things from a climate change perspective. So it's not going to solve New Zealand's mandate over the next year or two, but in the longer term, we have to change the land use and therefore not demand as much land for food production, but maybe then there would be some available for growing, I know, miscanthus or some fast-growing crops. So that's my comments.
As a nearly lifelong vegetarian, I can only endorse this, of course. But can I pick up on that suggestion, which would cover the current land use and making space for biofuel crops to be grown, but sort of take it a bit further? You mentioned earlier there's good and bad biofuels. So if for a New Zealand perspective, but also globally, is there something that you all think, this is to all of you, is there something that's worth pursuing, or do we need to look at synthetic biofuels? What are they anyway? And are there other ways of making non-fossil fuels?
I could talk to that one a little bit to begin with. So yeah, we talked a little bit about turning advanced biofuels. I pick up on that quote from IPCC that Ralph showed about the potential for advanced biofuels and these other things to deal with shipping and aviation. That goes back to this idea of using wood, and as Ralph said, yeah, it's extremely expensive to do that and requires a large amount of investment. It could be done, but it's not the best use of of the resource. So the MB has had this project called Wood Fibres Futures, and they've issued a couple of reports, and they looked into the economics of things that they could do with New Zealand's essential wood fibres resource, and it looked long and hard at making advanced biofuels and said, look, this has got a negative rate of return. There are much better options. This will require billions of dollars investment and create very expensive fuel. So we don't think it's a good idea. So and also it's almost completely irrelevant in relation to the obligation, because obligation motivates fuel suppliers to meet achieve compliance at lowest cost. So they are not going to spend billions of dollars to create extremely expensive fuel. So that's yeah, I can't. I mean, it would be great if it happened, but it just seems extremely challenging. And it also takes, even if it was a great idea that we hadn't thought of before, which it's not a new idea, it still takes a very long time to commercialize this sort of thing and get it pumping at scale. In the world, there are only a handful of plants that actually produce that kind of fuel. My colleague David estimated it between them, they produced 2% of the output of Marsden Point Refinery, and they're all pilot plants. They're not commercial entities, really. They're just demonstrations. There are other ways you could make fuel. I mean, really, photosynthesis is the main way we know how to turn CO2 into hydrocarbons. There are people trying to figure out other ways to do that, and Ralph probably knows more about those. The alternative, of course, is to go to a different kind of energy carrier, which requires a different type of motor, not a diesel motor or whatever it is, or a jet engine. Is to use hydrogen or something that's an energy carrier for hydrogen, like ammonia, burning ammonia. There are possibilities, but it's very challenging. Those are also very expensive fuels, and they also create this moral hazard around, well, if it's really expensive to make hydrogen out of renewable electricity, but relatively cheap to make it out of natural gas, and you've spent all this money on infrastructure, again, it creates this incentive to continue fossil fuel dependence. But that's a little bit off topic. I don't see those things coming in and saving the day in the next 10 years, if ever.
Go for it.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to echo what Jake said about advanced biofuels. I mean, again, looking at what happened here, I think there was a lot of hope that actually most of the target would be met with advanced biofuels, but because of lack of availability, that wasn't the case. Or we relied mainly on used cooking oil with the fraud issue that Jake raised as well. And now we actually have a limit on the amount of used cooking oil and animal fat that can be used because of these fraud questions, because of the lack of availability. So yeah, we ended up realizing as well that what we thought could be a good option was actually maybe not such a great pathway for the future. One thing also I wanted to flag is that we usually have these discussions in silos. So we look at transport as a isolated sector, but actually you have companies working with the bioeconomy for many years, which are relying on some of these advanced biofuels feedstock. So what we realized as well in Europe is that more and more companies were waking up and seeing that the biofuels industry was kind of taking the things they had been using for many years for producing, for example, biochemicals or pet food with animal fats, and now they are like, we need to stop the biofuels policy because otherwise we will have to turn to a kind of worse alternatives like palm oil, which are really not what they wanted to use at the first place. So I think these competing uses and the fact that we need to look at it as a bioeconomy overall is something we haven't managed to do in Europe, and I don't know if it's going to be possible in other countries, but yeah, we cannot look at things in silo and think that transport will use all that stuff when actually in other sectors there's already been a lot of uses there. In terms of alternatives, a good thing in the system in Europe now is that you have specific incentives for renewable electricity that also supports the electrification of road transport. You get credits when you have kind of delivered electricity to electric vehicles, and you have several countries that are putting that in place. Happy to share more information maybe afterwards. But so that's already something that is working in the system and that really contributes to the long-term decarbonization of transport. then for sectors like aviation and shipping, Jake already mentioned it, we're looking more at solutions like renewable hydrogen, either renewable hydrogen directly or ammonia, but also synthetic fuels produced from renewable hydrogen. And here I agree the cost will be quite high, and we need to make sure that we reduce demand as a first priority, electrify where we can, and then only as the last resort to focus on these alternatives. But here again, we now have specific targets for these renewable hydrogen fuels. So again, I mean, the policy started from biofuels, then realized that it was really not a great idea, and then is moving towards more electricity, hydrogen-based fuels. And it's going to take a long time to make sure that the system really goes into all these electricity-based fuels, but I think that's really the way forward.
Ralph, did you want to add something to this?
Just a point of information, Laura, you might not know, but New Zealand is 80-something% renewable electricity without any subsidies. We're quite proud of that. And my electric car and my electric bicycle, I've got a real bicycle, electric one as well, are being charged off my solar panels off the roof, and it's as cheap as anything, even with the cost of the panels. And so we're already well down that track. So for road transport, and we do have electric buses, and there's thousands of these in China and India and around the world, and there's electric trucks coming on stream. There are constraints on heavy freight just because of purely the weight of the batteries, but the constraint mostly is in long-haul aircraft, and that's really where we haven't got an alternative. In terms of hydrogen, I've got limited hope, just because not the cost so much, although Jake's quite right about green hydrogen, but it's the total inefficiency of the system. And we produced hydrogen for a farming community some, I don't know, 15 years ago. They wanted to go off grid, and we had wind turbine sites, but it cost 22,000 to bring an electric cable down the hillside to the community. And so we put an electrolyzer up there, produced hydrogen, brought the hydrogen down in a pipe for about $600, and in a gas pipe with a 1% leakage, and the fuel cell was under the house. So, we know how to produce the hydrogen, but it's expensive and it's very inefficient when you take over the whole system. So I've got some reservations whether that's really going to proceed. And it's a bit like the electric vehicles in 1900 were the most popular and held the land speed record. And then oil came along and people were saying, was it going to be petroleum vehicles or electric vehicles? And of course, petroleum won. And this is our biggest issue now. It's still so cheap and efficient. And we're now at this debate now, shall we go electric vehicles on road, or shall we go hydrogen vehicles? And Toyota, for example, in Japan, are backing fuel cell hydrogen vehicles at the moment, it seems. And so there's a question mark there as to which way we'll go. In terms of the IEA has a bioenergy implementing agreement, as they're called. It's got 40 or 50 implementing agreements on different topics, and this is the bioenergy one, of which they've got subsections there on biofuels, which have been going a long time, and collaboration between the member countries is key. But they've also got a biorefineries subgroup. And this is something that anything you produce from oil products, plastics, etc., you can produce from biomass, because, of course, oil once was biomass. It's CHO molecules, and if you're clever with the chemistry, you can sort of juggle it. And so the biorefineries are producing co-products, whether it's bioplastics or whatever. And there was one classic example in Sweden I visited maybe 20 years ago, and ethanol was the sort of sub-co-product. And they'd taken away the high value products, and then and they were left with the ethanol for a biofuel. So to use biomass and to integrate the products has got some possibilities as well. But again, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's sort of longer term. Synthetic biofuels, there's loads of research going on, and there's quite a few companies being set up. I wouldn't invest in any of them personally. And for advanced biofuels from lignocellulose, in the States, it must have been 10 years, maybe 12 years ago, there was, I can't remember, $10 million subsidy to 5 or 6 different companies with different processes, all intending to produce ethanol from their lignocellulosic waste products. And I don't think any of them have survived. So it is a huge challenge to turn some of these materials into useful liquid fuels. So therefore, as Jake quite rightly says, there is a constraint on the volumes. And again, I come back to the point that if we only got a little amount, we shouldn't be sticking it in road vehicles, we should be putting it in aeroplanes.
I'm going to bring in 2 questions from the audience, and then we've only got about less than a quarter of an hour. So I do want to wrap up by asking you all, just if not biofuels, then what to do with transport. But let's just look at a question here from Alex to Laura. Interested in your thoughts on Nestle. The Finnish Prime Minister was in New Zealand yesterday with a business delegation, including Nestle lobbyist. What's your experience of their sustainability of their biofuels, including their sustainable aviation fuel?
Thanks a lot for the question. We know Nestle very well. They've been very, very active in Brussels over all these years about biofuels. And I think we see a kind of broader trend of oil companies, like not only Nestle, but Total in France and in Italy and others, moving away from their oil-based refining kind of sector towards more biorefining. That's creating a huge kind of trend for these advanced biofuels and waste feedstocks, and that's really alarming, actually. Nestle has been a company which managed to portray itself as a really green company. But when you look at the type of biofuels they use, they actually still have a lot of palm oil in their business model. They always say that they're going away from palm oil and that they're having a lot of transparency and robust supply chain. But still, I mean, they're a big user of vegetable oil for biofuels production. Another thing that we had troubles with regarding Nestle is that their definition of what is a real waste is problematic. So we've had many years of debates and fights on what do you consider a waste that is not used by anyone. And they still pushed for the use of palm fatty acid distillate, PFAD. It's a very geeky terminology, but that's actually a byproduct from palm oil production. And they try to portray it as a waste when it's actually not. It's being used by other industries and it's useful in the bioeconomy overall. So I would really be careful with Nestle as a player, and I know that they're going around also in many member states and across the world and reaching out to many companies to sell their products and kind of appearing as the green industry, but they're not, and we really need to look in details at what feedstock they use. When you look more in details, there's a lot of problematic things there. So I'm happy to follow up bilaterally if you have if you need more details, but yeah, the lobby of Nestle is quite known here, and there's been reports also about their activities by NGOs in the Netherlands, for example. So there's some stuff out there if you want more information.
Thank you for that, Laura. And then I have a question from Kevin for Ralph or Jake. Z Energy set up a biofuel plant, and you mentioned that earlier, using tallow, but it's closed. Is there any interest in bringing it back into use? So they closed quite recently, right? But is there any interest of it being relaunched, revived?
Well, you go first.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak for Z Energy. It's a commercial decision, and Mike Bennett, the CEO there, was really supportive of the whole concept, and he's running the Climate Leaders Coalition of all the 100 businesses. So now Z Energy's heart's in the right place for reducing emissions. But if they can't make it work commercially, then it's a real challenge. The competition, I think, was coming from Singapore mostly for the tallow, and I quite why I don't know. So I think they were quite proud of the fact that they got the plant up and running, and then they had a few hiccups on the way through. But then it was working, and then to close it down was a sort of loss of face, really. And so I suspect they'd be really keen to get it going again if they could. But what other resource could they use? And there's not really anything available.
No, I mean, Zed made that decision in full knowledge that the government was working on a biofuels obligation. And they did have their plant up and running, and they were basically waiting for the price of tallow to drop from something over $2,000 a ton to about 500 apparently would make it viable. presumably a biofuels obligation would raise that threshold somewhat, but even so, they decided, no, we're just going, we've waited long enough. It's not going to pan out. Our strategy to meet the obligation is to import biofuel. And nothing has changed since they made that decision earlier in the year. So, yeah, and with all of this demand for biofuel from other countries, I just can't see the price of tallow dropping. And regardless, I mean, tallow, as even back in the old days, it was being used to make soap and candles and all sorts of things. So if we got hold of that tallow and used it for fuel, the people making soap and candles would have to use something else. And so that's the substitution effect that it's just really hard to get away with, despite using waste or things that we call waste, which are actually residues or byproducts. Or certification schemes, they can't really get around that. These are globally traded commodities which are valuable. People need to eat, and people need, they use cosmetics, they need soap. It's really hard to avoid. Yeah.
Just a quick comment on that, Veronika, if I can, is that lots of developing countries, for their lighting and for their cooking stoves, are moved away from fuel to ethanol, just to confuse the issue.
Lots of unintended consequences or sort of incentives that pushed in the wrong directions, like Laura mentioned earlier, that indirect deforestation. I can give you 2 minutes each and just ask you straight up. So given the experience we have with the US, with the EU, has the ship on biofuels sailed on a renewable fuel, of course, but should we not even go there? And what if we're talking about the transport sector, because we are talking about transport fuels for this proposed bill, what should we do instead? Whoever wants to go first, go for it, but 2 minutes each.
I'll go first. So our campaign is Stop the Biofuels Obligation, because we think on balance the risks and likely outcomes are, and harms associated with those are, so significant, and we have evidence of them occurring abroad that no matter how well the government tries to do it, that it will go wrong. Either they will greenwash unsustainable biofuel, or they will not be able to, they will strictly and successfully apply their sustainability criteria and the definitions of waste, and they won't make any wrong moves, and they'll find that they just can't get enough. And then we will have, either way, we end up with a hole in our emissions budgets, right? And this is what the government's concerned with. It's about, meeting emissions budgets. And we can't, obviously, it's completely immoral to try and meet those budgets through accounting tricks. We need, real emissions reductions, and we just need to do more of the stuff we know that works. So we know solar energy is a winner, okay, and we know that it would really help if we didn't consume so much stuff all the time, because the more we use, the more resources are devoted to making that stuff. I really think there's a lot more mileage in conservation which is just not being explored around how we get around, especially in the transport sector, but in other sectors too. It would be great to see, people cycle more, and it's this kind of nuclear arms race situation where people are like, oh, I won't go out on my bike because it's not safe, and it's not safe because everyone's driving, and people are driving because it's not safe to go out on their bicycle because everyone's driving. So there's got to be ways to sort of break down that vicious circle, and get some more mileage, so to speak, out of that. And certainly also for intercity travel, passenger rail, bring that passenger rail between our major centres, and beef up our bus and coach services between our cities as well. That would make a difference. There's a lot of scope there. We've got these amazing roads, and then if you look at how they're used it's ridiculously how inefficient it is. If you actually count the number of people on the road and just ignore the metal boxes they're in, they're spaced so far apart. The capacity there is huge.
Perhaps Laura?
Okay. Yeah.
Would you scrap the EU's biofuels policy? Would you get rid of it to replace it?
I think yes, actually. I mean, it's been, after so many years, we really tried to make it work, and we realized that, yeah, it's just impossible to get all the parameters right to ensure that you have, a good supervision of the supply chain, that you really have access to the feedstock that are sustainable and all that. I think overall it's really a minefield. So wherever we think that we've maybe found the feedstock that is not used by anyone, actually there's still something popping up where we realize that there are more issues with it. So is it worth the risk because we think that aviation will need maybe some type of waste-based biofuels? Maybe there are other ways to make it work and to push the aviation sector to use at least the little sustainable feedstock that will be available through other means than an obligation like the one that is being discussed in New Zealand. I think it's not worth taking the risk to set targets, but then not ending up with the results you wanted to get. So I think that would be my advice, that if we all agree that the aviation sector is the only place where this type of biofuels could play a role, then maybe there's another way around. And I would agree with Jake that for us, the most important is really to reduce energy demand. That's where we should all start. And then on that basis, move to direct electrification wherever it's possible. And for road, it's quite easy. And then for aviation and shipping, look at hydrogen-based solutions, but taking in mind that it's less efficient, more costly, and that then we need to decide as a society, where do we want to go and what type of fuel we want to accept, and for how much cost, like how much we want to pay for the different ways of transport we want to use. So yeah, I leave it here.
Ralph, for your bit, can I throw in an extra bit, which I was going to ask earlier, just about, to me it seems sort of counterintuitive that we ship so much of these resources back and forth to make biofuels. If you, in your final wrap-up, could also think about, would it make sense that each country resources for itself with the waste that's already here, with the resources that are already here? Would that be a possible source, or is it naive?
Well, yeah, that's why I would say we can't give up on biofuels, and we've got to look locally as to what's possible. What's the cost competitive dollars per tonne of carbon dioxide avoided, which is a good comparison, which we've used in IPCC for a while. And that does exclude a lot of biofuels because of their sustainability and environment. And we don't want to be shipping the stuff around the world either, as Laura was saying, coming into the EU. So, but we need all the help we can get. So if any good biofuels are available to be used, whether it's used cooking oils or whatever it might be, there will be occasions that we can't electrify everything. And it'll be a long time before Australia or China has good levels of renewable electricity, low carbon electricity. And that brings in nuclear power as well. If you go to France, what is it? 70% is nuclear there, and the French thing is magnifique. And but it is a way of getting to a low carbon future. And nuclear technologies are changing fast as well and developing at smaller scale and such like. So we want to electrify the fleet, the transport fleet, as far as we can. There's no question about that. But that's not going to happen overnight. And so it's a timing factor. We could throw a lot more money at biofuels research. There's already been some spent. But if we really want to solve the problem, then there's still some solutions that are being worked on in the labs now, but it will take a long time to commercialize. And so I've got a quote, and the IPCC, this latest report and the fifth assessment report very clearly said that there is a place for transport biofuels, gaseous and liquid, and let's keep working on it because they're not perfect. And so I think within this last report, I got a quote here: if done poorly, biofuels could worsen both food and water problems. If done poorly, and this is exactly the point that Jake and Laura are saying, that we know when we're doing it poorly, with deforesting or whatever it might be, competing land use, etc. So therefore, we've got to concentrate on what are good biofuels within any given location. And that's sort of easier said than done, but let's not give them up totally. We've got to have a little bit of hope that they might contribute something in the longer term. And the tallow is going, I think, Jake, to wherever it's going to. I think some of that's still being used for energy purposes, isn't it? Or even to biofuel. So it might be New Zealand tallow getting shipped over there, but it's not as if it's getting, and there's other sources of soap manufacture, and there's certainly other sources of lighting and heating. And so, we've got to use the priorities. So the animal fat is a waste product, inedible animal fat, not beef tallow, the inedible stuff from our sheep mostly. And that's a resource that we can use. It's only a small part. It will never solve the world's problems, nor will used cooking oil. But if you get 0.01% here and 0.1% there, it all sort of helps. So don't let's throw it away. Let's keep working at it, but let's be sensible about what's good and what's not good.
Thank you. Perfect summing up of the crux of this issue. Now, all I'm left to do is to thank you all on behalf of the organisers, Oxfam Aotearoa with Greenpeace. Laura Buffett, have a wonderful rest of your day over there.
Thank you.
Jake Roos and Ralph Sims. And thank you all who've tuned into this from wherever you are tuning in. And as a reminder to all of us, perhaps the closing date for submissions on the Sustainable Biofuels Obligation Bill is the 12th of January next year. That sounds scary. So one more time, thank you all for joining us. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa, kia haumaru, stay safe, look out for each other. And dare I say all the best for the festive season, because I gather it's not far away. Thank you,
and thanks,
very much,
Veronika.
everybody.
Thank
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 you.
you, Veronika.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.